Hello everyone, it is yet again another day in this, the clown decade, the decade where things are only going to get worse before they get better. And it is time yet again to look at another video by Politics Joe doing a vox pop around Britain, trying to show that there are a lot of extremists in Britain who turn out to either want exactly what we have already in Britain or something different that is perfectly reasonable. And this week they are deciding to ask the oldest place in Britain, that's oldest as in the place in Britain with the most elderly people, not oldest as in first founded, how to buy a house. And there is probably some salient points going to be made, and Joe will try and make out it's extreme to say you should save money to buy a house. So let's get into it.
My deposit was 2,500. I got a two-bedroom house and 2 acres of land.
Well, if nothing else, if you are a teenager or a young adult in the UK, this video will probably make you cry. Because yes, inflation is a hell of a thing, and it's meant that deposits for two-bedroom houses in, I'm not sure where this is yet, but generally in Britain, would need a deposit of £20,000 to £30,000. So 10 times the amount this woman needed for a deposit for her house. And I'm not even sure when she bought a house, but I would assume in the mid-80s.
What you're paying for a cup of coffee, a fiver, I don't know, whatever, but you can go home and put the kettle on, can't you?
Coffee's actually usually about £2 to £3 at the moment from Starbucks or Costa. It can be even higher if you go large and add all the extra bits. But again, this isn't the worst advice in the world. Try and save money where you can. You would be surprised at how much you can save. I myself didn't go on holiday for about 3 years, and I've managed to buy a house. You can actually save money, it is possible.
I don't think we're put onto this earth to scrimp and save and do practically nothing until, we get a deposit for a house.
Yeah, the Victorians didn't think that either. I don't quite have the direct graph to hand showing the amount of homeowners versus renters from the 1800s because Google isn't playing with me today, but I think this graph makes for a good proxy, in that it's showing that the average house price compared to the median wage was way higher in the Victorian period than it is now, and so you actually ended up having something like 80% of the country renting. Actually, what stopped people from renting and actually starting to buy houses is that dip in World War One. And you may think, oh, that's because a load of men went and died and therefore there was less demand. No, that's not actually the case. The reason that happened is because of rent control. And you may be thinking, oh, well, we just need rent control to get home ownership up. Well, yes, but that also means that a lot of people can't then afford rent where they would need it. Really, the best thing to do, which is what we actually did post-World War One and Two, was actually build a load of houses. At least that's what we need to do now, because demand is constantly being subsidised by government-sponsored programmes, such as Help to Buy ISAs, artificially low interest rates, and, as the latest move by the government shows, supporting 1% deposit mortgages. All stuff that all it does is increase house prices. Get rid of all that, the house prices you will see go down.
Young people around the country are desperate to buy their own home, but just can't. Trapped between a mercenary private rental sector and eye-watering house prices, we're forced into bizarre housing situations. We might have to put up with black mould, or have to pay half our rent in cash to a strange woman every 3 months in return for a flat with no living room.
Just for context, obviously, Joe is based in London and Manchester, so it's not particularly surprising that rent prices will be high. They are at the centre of media organisations. You have Salford Quays in Manchester, which is where you see an awful lot of media groups conglomerating to try and have outside of London offices, and in doing so, obviously, there's a lot of demand for rent around there. And then obviously you've got London, which is the capital city. I mean, of course you're going to pay an awful lot of rent for not an awful lot more. Of course, there are choices outside of this, and to be honest, if you're working for an online magazine anyway, I don't know why you can't work from home. And again, these things all come down to choices. I've chosen to work from home, therefore I can work anywhere. I have given myself even more choice while taking a slight hit to my money, and in doing so, because I can literally live anywhere, I decided to go live somewhere cheap and actually afford a house to get myself on the housing ladder. And if you don't want to do that, that's fine, that's entirely your choice, but you're obviously going to pay more when you limit your options like that. And that's a problem I'm seeing a lot of people my age and slightly younger running into. Yes, house prices are extortionate. I do agree. I would like to see them come down, but at the same time, to try and imply that they're completely unaffordable and you are just going to be living in squalor, it's complete nonsense. Yes, I agree you can have bad landlords, but most are pretty good, and when it comes down to the black mould thing, I have no doubt that they are referencing this recent Channel 4 news segment.
And Fatima says her home is making her sick. Over 14 years, Fatima's long list of medical conditions has grown to include severe asthma, chronic lung disease, COPD, lupus, depression, and anxiety. She says living in this damp flat has taken all of that away from her.
So just to make that very clear for you, this woman, Fatima, who was, according to this documentary, a dental nurse with very few health problems, ended up having to move to a council estate in East London 14 years ago and developed health problems from living in a damp flat. And obviously this comes from the mould in said flat.
The family is paying a cleaner to come twice a week and have to replace the carpets every other year.
So the place just sounds like an awful place to live. And so my natural question would be, okay, you're getting a cleaner to get in and fix the mould, but the mould keeps coming back. That screams to me that there's a problem with the house somewhere. You probably have a leak somewhere. And so you need to go to whoever runs this flat, probably the council, and say, look, this mould keeps coming back. Can you please review the situation or give me an alternative? And oh, it turns out that she was given 2 alternative places to live, and this was her reaction to being given 2 alternative places to live.
The first one is all damp, all damp. The second one is a new, but is stairs, and the stairs is the same the one I have now.
So not suitable for someone with disabilities.
With disability.
So the first one is an old dump. I have no idea what she means by that. I think living in an old dump, quote unquote, would be better than living somewhere that is literally causing you to have disabilities. And the second place apparently has stairs. But apparently this flat has stairs as well. So effectively what has happened here is that an apparent beggar has become a chooser. Literally the council is saying, okay, we'll offer you other accommodation since this is clearly affecting your health negatively. And she's not taking it. So I have no sympathy for her. This segment then goes on to look at other rooms and says just something that I find really, really odd, because I've rented before and had black mould before, and I cleaned it all the time, because it's a reality of having a house in Britain. You get mould because it gets cold and humid.
It also makes you think about what Fatima's house would look like if she didn't constantly wipe the walls.
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, it's like a daily task.
I mean, it should never get to the point where it's a daily task. I mean, I've had to wipe black mould down in absolutely every home I've lived in. You know, recently it got pretty bad in my own home because we lost the boiler. It just stopped working. And so while we were waiting for a boiler repairman to come and actually get the replacement part, oh, guess what? The house got pretty cold. It was pretty damp from all the condensation. We've had black mould come up. What do? We clean it. It's no one else's responsibility. And okay, I own the house, but even when you are living as a tenant, it is still your responsibility to keep the house in good order. If there's a leak to the property or something like that, yeah, that's the landlord's problem. If it's just general cleaning and you let mould get out of hand, yeah, it's your problem. So I don't understand what this segment is trying to say. Like, yeah, these houses get particularly damp. Sure, that's the landlord's issue, but no one's living in that apartment, so no wonder it's getting out of hand. But the reason it's uninhabited is because of the black mould. You literally cannot allow someone to live there while there's black mould like that. It would need to be cleaned off. Anyway, point being, yes, some flats have black mould. Yes, the tenants need to clean it. If it is a recurring problem, it's probably something wrong with the house, and by law, whether it's council or private, the landlord needs to actually do something about it. The landlord is offering options to Fatima for an alternative to get away from the black mould, and she is taking neither option. As far as I'm concerned, it's entirely on her if she gets worse health problems. Anyway, back to the actual video at hand.
I should know. That's literally my current living situation.
Don't live in London then. Again, Politics Joe is an online magazine. I don't particularly understand why it can't be a work from home situation, and your guy does Vox Pops around the UK. Again, why does it matter exactly where you live? And if Politics Joe is saying you have to be in the London office every day, well, again, that was your choice. I'm not at all saying, by the way, that there's nothing you can do about the housing situation in Britain and therefore we just need to leave it as is. I'm actually the opposite and say we need to build more houses, but this is the living situation we're in, and as I myself have proved, and I have friends who have proved, because pretty much every friend I have from school now owns a house at the Well, we're all under 30, I'll put it that way. Yes, granted, it is later than previous generations, but again, this is the world we live in. These changes are going to take time. As far as I care, you're probably being able to afford to live in London, especially in earlier years, via handouts from your parents, which I think is absolutely fine, by the way. But again, you're in this situation through your own choices, nobody else's. So don't give me this whole section of the poor me's, because I really don't care. They are the consequences of your own life choices and actions. And you're in a job that you love and can actually afford to have. You're one of the few people that can afford to actually live in London. There's some good to take from that.
But whether the housing crisis facing young people is to do with our addiction to OnlyFans and avocado lattes, or to do with the fact it would take 50 years to tackle the housing deficit, what is clear is we really need some advice on buying homes.
The thing is, that 50-year deficit is actually only at best case scenario. Because according to the big issue, if the government hits its target of building 300,000 homes a year, it would still take 50 years to fill the UK's 4.3 million housing backlog, and think tank has found. Instead, it would take 442,000 homes a year to be built for the next 25 years, or 654,000 built for each of the next 10 years to end the housing crisis, according to new research from the Centre of Cities. Which is quite an awful lot, and you probably wouldn't need that many houses being built if 700,000 people weren't coming over every year, and that's just net, by the way. Gross, it's closer to 1 million. But then you run into a big problem when you actually look at the statistics of the number of houses we're building. Because as of the financial year for 2021, we only built 204,530 dwellings in the whole of the UK. And naturally, the vast majority of them are in England, because the vast majority of them will be in London, where most people want to go, because that's where the vast majority of jobs are. And this is part of the reason that London has very, very high rent prices, because there is so much demand there. It's actually pretty amazing that one of my friends, who are actually a couple, managed to actually afford a house in London. And I'll put it this way, it was between 4 and 5 times the amount that I paid for a house in Wales. Again, everyone's personal choices have consequences. If you want to live in London, I'm afraid you have to live with high house prices, until we can finally get around the fact that London needs a hell of a lot more mid and high rises to actually make up for the fact that it is a financial centre where a lot of jobs are. But for some reason, local councils in London would just prefer to keep car parks where people are driving less anyway.
And who better to ask than old people? 35.8% of British homeowners are over the age of 65.
Well, even if you had a perfectly level playing field throughout time when it came to house prices and the housing stock, you would still see more older people having houses, simply due to the fact, and for some reason I have to explain this to everyone who's under the age of 40, by the fact that they are older and have therefore been able to actually accumulate wealth. Oddly enough, I think the best way to actually deal with this problem is just to lower taxes, to give them more disposable income, and allow people to make businesses, the young to be entrepreneurs, and actually make the money through actually selling useful goods and services. But politics, Joe, is full of communists, so they'd rather just seize the old people's houses and then redistribute that money to the young people who they think deserve it for doing absolutely nothing.
That's why I'm in North Norfolk. North Norfolk is the oldest place in the country. The average age of people here is 54, 14 years older than the national average.
Well, I'm sure these older people will have nuggets of wisdom from their own life experiences, so yeah, let's find out.
Somewhat unsurprisingly, more people in North Norfolk own their homes outright than anywhere else in the country, which makes it the perfect place to ask, how can I buy a house?
Move to North Norfolk, apparently. They've got a pretty good track record of buying your house, so move there.
Wow.
Oh, just tell them what you did. Yes, house prices are higher and it's harder to get your foot on the ladder these days, but look, my entire family has done it, all my friends have done it, and to be honest, from all of them that I know, they all either got very good jobs or very cheap houses. In most of the cases, it was both. It is perfectly possible to buy your own home, whether it's a flat or a 2-bedroom place with a decent garden. And as I'm sure many of these elderly people will tell you, they had to scrimp and save for their own house as well. Because yes, it sounds very nice that houses used to cost £200 back in the 18th century, but that's £200 in those days' money. That would probably cost £500,000 in today's money. So again, the 20th century, especially post-war when it came to housing, actually quite a strange time when it comes to the history of the planet. And yes, I would like to go back to it and make it permanent, but instead of trying to find out why houses were so cheap back then, again, you just want to go to the typical communist thing of, oh, it's because of capitalism. Because that's going to be the underlying blame of this entire video, because it's what it is for every Politics Joe video.
I bought my first house when I was 23.
Yes, I think so. I bought my first one when I was 18.
Yep, once again, very good news for them. I am happy that they managed that. They probably were able to afford it through a mixture of things. Higher interest rates, less population and immigrants, more housing were probably built compared to the number of people as well. In other words, yes, they are quite lucky that they grew up in the time they did, but at the same time, as I myself have said in this video, people who are young can still afford houses. You just have to get out of London or have an extremely good job in London. It also helps to have a dual income, by the way. Pretty much everyone I know who has a house is either renting it out with a roommate or housemate, or is in a committed relationship. Pretty much everyone I know who owns a house is in one of those scenarios. Apart from one of my friends who lives in Liverpool, but that's because Liverpool's very cheap.
When did you first buy your own home?
Well, it was my mum's, and so I came by that when she passed away in 2011.
Yep, that's another way I've known people to get their own homes, by inheriting it off a family member. Again, nothing completely out of the ordinary here when it comes to political decisions. Yes, I admit they have made it far, far worse, but again, I don't really know what you want from these people. And I certainly don't know which part of this is extreme.
Do you mind me asking when you got on the property ladder?
Ooh, 1972.
And what do you remember what your deposit was?
My deposit was 2,500.
Oh wow, so it was 10 years earlier than I estimated earlier. It was actually the early 70s, not the mid-80s. And yes, I'm sure that's making a lot of youth watching this cry, but let's bear in mind that that was £2,000, or £2,500 I should say, in 1972. According to the Bank of England's inflation calculator, this deposit would mean £28,346.27 in the money of December 2023. That's actually quite a standard deposit of 10% for most houses today, at least up in the north. In London, you're probably looking at more than double that. But again, I have no idea where this woman first lived. If that was up in the north, then from the looks of it, house prices and deposits really aren't that bad a thing. To be clear, I mean off this one anecdote. When it comes to general trends, it's obviously harder today. But that's why most people rent.
Blimey. Well, we bought well, it was our council house we bought, and I think the whole thing was only 25,000 when we bought, so I don't think we had... It was about 3,000, 2,000, something like that. We didn't put much down.
Again, that's just for the deposit, and he's saying between 2,000 and 3,000. And this obviously was buying a council house, so this would have been after Right to Buy was introduced in 1980. So again, this is a very rough estimate because I'm making a lot of assumptions, but assuming he put 2,500 down in 1982, today that would be £8,533. Now bear in mind, at the time the discount would have been anywhere from a third of the valuation to 50% of the valuation. So for sake of argument, let's say it was 40% discounted. So assuming this tenant bought the house with a mortgage for £85,000, that would mean the total cost for the house would be about £127,500. Again, when it comes to the modern day right to buying, it's really not that much more than you would expect to see today. Again, anecdotal, and I'm not saying there isn't a housing crisis, but what I am saying is that it's not as easy as these millennials are trying to make out. The main difference is that the people of the generation below were buying houses 5 to 10 years earlier than we are in the modern day. Alright, fine, I want it to be possible to buy a house at 18 to 21-year-old. Part of the thing that will probably help with that is actually getting people into work from the age of 16, but no, we have to keep people learning maths up until the age of 18.
And what did you get in return for that?
I got a two-bedroomed house and 2 acres of land.
Again, this was the woman whose deposit turned out to be just under £30,000. Again, you need to ask where this was. If it was in the north, that's fairly reasonable. If it was in the southeast or London, that would be very cheap, yes. But again, we need to find out where this was. But based off the accent, I would say she was from the southwest, which again has much cheaper houses than London and the southeast. So again, probably a fairly reasonable to expect in modern day money about £300,000 for 2 bedrooms and 2 acres.
Yes, indeed.
How many bedrooms, etc. was it?
The 3 bedrooms and a large garden.
That sounds quite impossible. Oh, it is impossible this stage.
Well,
I currently live in a 3-bedroom flat, and large garden is relatively, I'd say, subjective. I'd say it's a medium-sized garden. So I'm quite literally living proof that this is possible. And bear in mind that this guy's a millennial. I'm on the cusp of Gen Z and millennial. No, it's completely possible. It's just not possible in London. But again, I don't think this guy brought a house in London. And once again, he was buying a council house at a lower rate than you would see on the market, because it actually ended up saving the government a hell of a lot of money by simply letting people own their own houses at discounted rates, because it was such a drain on the economy at the time.
This is it. That was when the Conservatives sold all the council houses off and haven't redone them, which is why the housing situation's so bad at the moment.
Oh, that's a bad take. Just because you sell off the council houses doesn't mean you need to buy more. I'll agree part of the issue is the fact that we're not building houses, as much as I know my audience is very, very anti-YIMBY, but that's why I'm also giving the alternatives. I think the main thing is actually just interest rates. But yeah, this guy has completely misunderstood the point of the right to buy. It was so that the government doesn't have control over a massive housing stock over the people of the country. If you're just replacing it with other council houses, you've kind of missed the point.
Do you know how much that property would be worth now?
Well, I just sold it I sold it 20 years ago, and it went for 650,000.
Likely due to the house being well maintained and likely renovated as well. Again, £600,000 depends entirely where it is, but I mean, I saw my old family home up on the market recently that I believed my parents moved the family out in 2001, so that's 23 years ago. I believe it was sold for about £300,000, and today it's worth £800,000, something in that vicinity. And inflation alone would mean it would be worth, in today's money, at about £540,000 when my parents sold it. So yes, once again, thanks to all the demand side subsidies, absolutely no supply side reforms, and from the pictures I saw of the house, complete renovations of the place to make it look a hell of a lot better from what I remember when I was 4 years old, it ended up adding about £260,000 to the value. I mean, again, that's enough to buy a relatively cheap house that you can just do up and rent out. I mean, we haven't even got onto the advice these old people have for young people to buy a house yet, but I'm pretty much giving every boomer answer that you can give, because I don't think it's bad advice. And at the same time, I can appreciate that, yes, it is harder these days, but as I say, all your life choices have consequences. I've put off doing a lot of things to buy a house with my girlfriend. As I say, I didn't go on holiday for 2 or 3 years. It's just a reality of life. I made that choice and I managed to get a house from it. I don't think there should be any problem with suggesting that that's what you should do to afford one.
Do you feel sorry for young people or people trying to get on the housing ladder?
Oh, yes. Yes, it's a big struggle for them. And, you know, if they're in a situation where in the end they have to rent, and then how do you rent a property and save at the same time?
The same way you pay for a mortgage and save at the same time. But again, I think a problem with the UK is this obsession with owning your own home. And I think from the right wing, there's a lot of people saying, well, if you own your home, you're obviously going to be more conservative because you have an interest in making the country run properly. But you're just completely ignoring empirical evidence if you think that, because new research has suggested actually that owning your own home makes absolutely no difference to your outlook on life. And the reason for that, I think, is that when you do finally own your home, you're going to then run into further milestones that actually a lot of left-wingers are trying to find alternative answers to when it comes to, say, childcare, doctor appointments, schools, education, healthcare, all that sort of thing, where under 13 years of Tory government, yes, those have all got worse. A lot of people won't then make the leap to say, oh, well, the Tories are moving more to the left, that's going to be the issue. No, they think the Tories are moving even more to the right because, for some reason, the vast majority of our political commentators are completely moronic, and in this whole new elite situation where, frankly, you only hold opinions to have high status and not because they work or because there is empirical evidence to support them or anything like that. And the same thing happens with housing. You buy a house, you will become more politically active. That part is absolutely true. But you won't change your perspective on, I want more council housing, I want the Tories out, etc., etc., because it wasn't the magic bullet everyone thought. It's actually quite a Marxist view, as Frederick Engels actually wrote the book about this, called The Housing Question, where he indeed thought if you don't own a home, you're obviously going to be revolutionary. Well, it turns out that even owning a home makes you revolutionary because it is now cool to be revolutionary. The long and short of this whole rant is just to say there's absolutely nothing wrong with renting. I can see why people think it's just money being thrown away, but no, you are spending money on a literal house. And yes, I know it doesn't accumulate wealth to yourself, but again, that's where saving comes in. And to be honest, renting is a lot less stressful than owning a house from my own experience. Since I've owned a house, I've had so many problems that I've had to fix with the house that I can't just call a landlord for. It gets in the way of everything else and has ended up probably costing more than if I had just rented in this time. But obviously I appreciate the advantage that I am now paying towards what is essentially an asset that I can sell on for the money. So I can understand why that would be an aspiration, but I think an awful lot of people say, oh, I need to buy a house because that's what I'm told I should be doing. And it's that aspect that I want to change.
I think that local housing associations could do a little bit more to help the younger generation, but the problem of it is housing association house come empty, they seem to be auctioning them off instead of opting to give them to a young family who wants to start off, you know.
Again, I don't know what this mindset is, but everyone seems to think that there's just a finite number of houses and that it's a zero-sum game, when that wouldn't be the case at all if, again, we could actually build houses. And look, I'm not saying we need 1 million Barratt homes sprawling over every countryside. That's obviously not what I'm saying. What I am saying, though, is that the Town Planning Act of 1948 needs to be burnt to a cinder, because it is from there that all these housing regulations come in, and that the only people that can afford to build are the Barratt associations, most of which then end up costing more than any other house, because what you end up doing is only actually owning about half the house, therefore having to pay rent for the other half of the house after already paying your mortgage off for half the house. And not only that, you then have to pay Barratt Homes because you are on the land that they own. And so it's just the worst of all worlds, actually buying a Barratt home. But then there's so much red tape in the way for any other sort of development to be made. This is why you see them all sprawling and barely even being occupied. And then, of course, during construction, they all cut corners. Once again, basically, regulation has absolutely ruined another market. And unfortunately, it had to be the housing market. And because of that, and because it's them making everything else so expensive, it's just ended up making a bunch of communists. The Tories, to be honest with you, have probably known this for quite a while, but want to do absolutely nothing about it.
The conventional wisdom given to a lot of people is by people advising people to buy their own homes, stop wasting money on takeaway coffees or avocado on toast. What do you make of things like that?
It's good advice. That's all I can say.
I tend to agree. I'd probably not be popular for saying so. But no, I mean, years ago, I mean, you did have to save, and you know, a lot of people just buy coffees and that as a matter of course. They go to work, they buy takeaway coffee, takeaway lunch and things like that.
I mean, again, it's unpopular, but you do things like this. You just sacrifice something for a few years, 2 or 3. You'd be surprised at how much you can save. From my own perspective, when I started working at a supermarket part-time, I would actually buy my lunch there because it was on discount, and I think it only ended up costing me about £3 something a day. But that's not where the issue came in, because I just want to get that out of the way. I'd actually also then buy myself some sort of treat for the afternoon, usually costing around £5, just snacks, soft drinks, things like that. Again, as I say, about £5, well, I was doing that 5 days a week, and after about 2.5 months I kind of started realising, wait, I can kind of see where people are coming from, because in that 2.5 months alone, that was £250 that I was spending on things I didn't even need. It was basically just, I'm here, I feel like I should buy something, therefore I will. You know, you overcome that. I realised I spent £250 on treats that I didn't even need, so I started saying, okay, I'll only do it on my last day, and from there I should be saving some money. And then I worked out that after like 2 years of doing that, I'd saved something like £1,500, probably a bit more. That was 10% of my deposit. And you may say, well, that's not much really, is it? Well, every little helps, you know. Over time, I would be ending up earning more anyway, because I ended up moving jobs. I ended up on more money thanks to a rise in minimum wage while I was there. I ended up with a second job. You know, I saved money in other ways, but even simple things like that, as I say, 2 years not indulging yourself every day, 10% of my mortgage, of my deposit, sorry. You'd be surprised how much you can save just by saving a tiny bit. If you end up putting aside £1 a day over 3 years, you end up with over £1,000. That's a holiday just from putting aside a very small amount every day. You can afford a holiday, and a pretty decent one at that. Sure, you might only be able to do it once every 3 years, but again, you need to look outside just the saving small amounts aspects, in that as you move on with your life, you are inevitably going to get better pay over the years, which also helps you save. It's one thing I've noticed. When you can afford a house, it feels almost overnight, but I genuinely think there's a kind of attitude for a lot of young people where they automatically think, as they're constantly being told here, which again I keep proving wrong, that they'll never be able to afford a house. So what's even the point of saving? What's the point of all this? And so they won't even do it. But as I say, I tried it myself and it worked. There's no reason it can't work for you.
I mean, I can remember I used to take my own sandwiches and take a flask, things like that.
I mean, luckily for me, I work from home, so I will admit this is a lot easier for me than probably a lot of other people. However, again, it's perfectly valid advice. You're probably saving yourself per week about £20 just by doing this alone. You times that by 52, that's already saving you over £1,000. Again, it's not nothing when you put it in those terms. All it takes is a bit of willpower, and yeah, you're going to want to treat yourself sometimes. That's fine. Still doing that, you're saving an awful lot of money.
We didn't have all this Costa coffees and things like that. I mean, quite honestly, what you're paying for a cup of coffee, £5, I don't know, whatever, but you can go home and put the kettle on, can't you?
Yeah. To which a standard answer I get from young people is generally, oh, well, why shouldn't I be able to treat myself? And again, that's not the point. The point is that you're overindulging, you're over-treating yourself. And in doing so, you're not managing to save any money for a deposit or for anything else that you want. Again, I know young people that say, oh, I can't save for a deposit, and they're going off on ski trips once a year. And you can't just help but think, could you not go somewhere cheaper than the Alps for a year and save yourself a few £100s? Because that genuinely would go a long way. But no, they'd rather demand full-blown communism instead.
Yeah. Go to the young people who are single parents. They don't have avocado on toast. They'll probably be lucky if they get a piece of toast, never mind about avocado. So no, that's rubbish.
I mean, this woman's clearly thinking back to her day and age, because these days single mothers are, saying well off isn't the right way to put it, but they're certainly better off than they will have been when this particular woman brought a house. And I'm sure I bring this up every time, but I know people who are nurses, and when they've worked on maternity wards and they see single mothers or single mothers to be, you know, it comes up in conversation, oh, you're excited to have the baby, you know, where's the dad and things like that. And most of the time, if there's no dad involved, it's, oh, I'm just having this baby for the benefits, for the welfare. They're just open about it, which that's just an entirely different issue. But this woman's point is simply that, once again, a lot of young people are just overindulging themselves. You don't need avocado on toast. It doesn't even taste that nice. And there are much cheaper alternatives for your breakfast that in turn would actually fill you up more and want to make you eat less anyway. You know, just having bacon and eggs in a sandwich, that's probably cheaper than buying an avocado and putting it on toast, and it would fill you up more.
If people, shall we say, cut down on perhaps 3 takeaways a week, how much they would save?
Again, just good advice, and the same as I was saying before, overindulgence, oh, I don't have money. Well, again, this is the consequence of your own actions. Stop being greedy.
Then I think the average housing deposit for a 3-bed flat in this country is now about 34 grand. So I think, to my opinion, cutting out a takeaway a week actually really wouldn't really make much of a dent in that.
Even just cutting it down to once a month, I think you'd be very much surprised. Again, oh, let's do some quick maths. I used to order a takeaway a week once I started being paid a hell of a lot more than when I was in my part-time work at a supermarket. And so I started to indulge myself then, because I had a saving plan. I knew what my budget was, so I knew I could treat myself to this. I'd say the average takeaway just for myself would cost me £20. I think £20 is pretty average, and that's probably underestimating it. If I didn't pay for that takeaway every time and instead was bothered to actually make my own food at home, even if it was a bit greasy, I could probably on average make one a week for about £5 if, I bought the chips in advance to use the 4 portions that are in there, bought the burger, whatever, the chicken, the oil, whatever, etc., etc. I don't need to go into detail. That's £15 a week. Once again, you do that for an entire year, that's a saving of £780. Again, £750,000. Let's say your saving plan includes 3 years of that. You've saved £2,340. Again, even if you are trying to save £34,000 for a deposit, that's close to 7% of the deposit. That's, again, it's not that bad. It's not nothing. And no doubt you will have been earning more money over those 3 years. My salary doubled from 5 years ago. And no doubt it's going to go up quite quickly in the near future as well. Like, you're on a good career path, you can do this. But for some reason, these middle-class millennials just think it's completely impossible. I don't know exactly what it is, but there's absolutely no aspiration. No willing to sacrifice anything. I mean, every little helps. It really does. Get a Tesco Club card. You'd be surprised at how much you save by that. It's really annoying that instead it's just I give up. Oh, there's going to be no dent anyway. No, there will be after some time. You'd be shocked.
It's a difficult one, isn't it? Because I suppose we come from a generation that expects people to have discipline, and that equals social discipline as well, which means that if you want something, you've got to work for it and save and generate it yourself.
Yeah, that includes not being decadent upon yourself. It's another point I make all the time, but when it comes to, people are in poverty, look at how much poverty has increased, it's a statistical nightmare, because all it means is that either the median wage has gone up, or we're using a completely different metric, such as how many people are using food banks. When the reality of the situation is that pretty much everybody in the United Kingdom owns an iPhone, owns an iPad, owns a television, owns all of these luxury items, and yet they're still considered to be in poverty. I mean, you go look at actual, real, genuine poverty in the third world somewhere, say Africa, India, these places, you'll know what poverty is really like. I mean, poverty has literally been solved in the United Kingdom. Yes, we still have a lot of homeless people. Yes, I'm not saying it's absolutely perfect. But my God, it's this thing that you are in poverty unless you are acting as a very standard lower middle class person and have the things that a lower middle class person has, which effectively just includes actually having some money put away in savings. That's all it really means to not be in poverty in the UK at this point. And I would like to constantly improve the living standards of people in this country. Don't get me wrong, I'm not dismissing this as any sort of non-problem. What I am saying, let's be realistic about it. We're doing pretty well. Despite being in a cost of living crisis, it's not exactly solving the obesity crisis at the same time, is it? That's all I'm saying.
But of course, the situation has to be built, I should say, by the government in a way to allow that to take place.
Yep, I completely agree. There are things that government can do to improve the situation. Loosen housing regulations so that it is easier to build, and I mean that in both the senses of where you can build, because there's an awful lot of greenbelt space that just looks horrendous and is just actually already concrete that looks ugly, and also the type of houses we can build. There are so many regulations that, as I said, you can basically only have houses that look like Barratt new builds if you build en masse, when in reality we have modular housing now that can be put up within days. But for some reason we're not taking advantage of that, and it's probably because the entirety of the UK's economy is based on having a housing bubble with an NHS tumour attached on the side. And you disturb that, you're probably asking for a government to have to ask the people to make a lot of sacrifices.
And so, yes, I'd expect we do see a lot of young people about who are probably spending perhaps when they shouldn't be and should be saving, but one still has to live. Yeah. And one still has to enjoy the best years of your life, which in a lot of times are when you're younger.
Sure, but you don't need to be spending your money all the time to have a good time. Again, I had a pretty good time between the ages of 23 and 26, and I didn't go on holiday. The last time I went abroad was to Poland, and that was last March. The time I went away before that was to Cyprus in, I think that would have been 2017. So that's a good 6 years of not going abroad. In the meantime, I would be going to Wales to see my girlfriend. I would be travelling to London for events and seeing friends and things like that. Obviously, I had weddings as well to go to, among other things. And yeah, as I say, I had a good time, I'd say, without having to spend a lot of money for holidays. And guess what? I could save up for a house. Oh, but I want to go on holiday. Again, your choice.
And I don't think we're put onto this earth to scrimp and save and do practically nothing until, we get a deposit for a house.
If there was any quote that I would say is pure modernism, I would probably say it's that quote. Because, again, it's a very, very modern problem to have to scrimp and save for a deposit. Throughout the rest of time in the United Kingdom, well, especially in the modern day, you would just be renting. And I think the main reason people want to own their own home is because they're jealous of people that do. And I think that's it. Whereas I don't see the reason why you should have to be. I mean, you can still save enough for an inheritance for the future generations, even when you're renting. Because there is absolutely nobody I know who owns a house who doesn't also have a savings account. But again, because we need a housing bubble to keep the NHS running, the overwhelming incentives are, oh, you absolutely need a house, otherwise you're poor. And that's how people think, when in reality, you could be renting out a penthouse apartment and be the richest person in Britain. You don't need to own property to be considered rich. It's just that a lot of people put their money into property because it's a very good investment. And that's the thing, until putting money in housing is not seen as a good investment, you're probably going to keep seeing the bubble get bigger and bigger and bigger until it bursts again, just like in 2008.
I can't give them any advice. I mean, what do you say to them? Go and get a job. There are no jobs.
We apparently have a labour shortage in the UK. To say that there is no jobs out there is just absurd. In fact, the vacancies in July to September 2023 was close to 1 million jobs. So to say there are no jobs is ridiculous. 1 million of anything is a lot. Of jobs, it is especially a lot. And yes, job vacancies are falling, as the statistics say, but if you've got close to 1 million, you've got an awful lot of vacancies.
Go and get higher wages. They don't pay higher wages.
Medium wage stagnation is indeed a real thing. As you can see here, there is a rise in the average earnings, but that's in nominal GBP, i.e. it is not adjusted for inflation. I adjusted the lowest number for inflation to try and make it even, and £17,803 in 1999 is about £32,648 in December of 2023. So in real terms, wages have gone up by about £2,000, but that just comes to the median. And obviously with the rate that house prices are going up, it's not keeping up at all. Yeah, I can agree with that, but the thing is that this is on a macro level. You look on a micro level by the individual, there is absolutely no reason that you can't improve yourself and your standings within your own job to earn more. There will be someone younger and less qualified than you to replace you from your old job, and there will be older people that you can be replacing higher up. That's generally how these things should be going. When it comes to wage stagnation anyway, I entirely blame it on the public sector. They have had absolutely no improvement in productivity over the past few decades, whereas the private sector have gone right up. You want to make money, you go to the private sector. That would be my advice. 1 million vacancies.
You go to university, you come out of university, they all expect high-paid jobs. They're not there. And the few that are there are snatched up, aren't they? The creme de creme.
And no doubt those people that got the good jobs can afford a house not long after. How do I know that this happens? I know people that took up those jobs, and they are buying houses. But anyway, the whole overeducating the population is yet another issue that comes into it. Oh, why are there so many graduate jobs these days? Because there are so many graduates. Why do they all turn out to be completely meaningless jobs that don't feel like they go anywhere? Because there are so many graduates taking them. Because I did 2 years of a graduate scheme and I wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible because it was literally just absolutely brimmed with people who the whole idea was you're trained in some sort of specialisation. Obviously mine was software. You are then put onto consultancy programs for all sorts of different companies. Typically, we were told they last for 2 years, and then naturally people just stay on there and move on with their career within that company, i.e. they're sold off by the companies who like their consultants. Never happened with most people, though. Most people ended up just being quite bored in their own jobs and didn't really know what to do and were just kind of trying to pass the time there. Me and a few other people I know that went there, though, who were quite fed up of that. Some people took the risk and just left and tried to make their own way. I, however, made sure that I had a job, another job I should say, before I actually left there because, as I say, working for big corporations isn't my idea of having a good work-life balance because they expect an awful lot. Again, work for a small company that you can see going somewhere, that would also be my advice. And if you're complaining that there aren't many of them, well, as I say, we should probably then get rid of a lot of regulations because, from my experience with small companies, that is the biggest barrier to actually helping them grow. In short, what I'm saying is learn to code and you'll probably be fine.
Everyone mentions in the news, or you're fed in the news, all about the boats and that kind of thing, and they worry about is there enough housing for everyone? And then we've got people coming into this country that aren't from this country, and does that put more of a burden on the local authorities to provide housing when even some of our armed forces struggle to get housing when they leave? I'm ex-forces myself, so it's...
Oh no, we're blaming the foreigners. Is this what's extreme about Britain? Is it extreme to point out that when you get more people in, there's more of a pressure on the demand side? I don't know. That sounds pretty extreme. The one thing I will say is that wouldn't even matter if you were building a decent amount of houses, but I know where that's going to lead to. Oh, I don't want to build houses for the foreigners. Yeah, that's fine. I can completely understand that. I especially understand why you don't want houses being built at your expense for foreigners. That's fine, I agree with that. What I am going to point out, though, is that housing isn't a zero-sum game. You can always build more, and I'm completely with you that the whole idea of the private market alone, obviously, building houses, is that really they should be there for people who are of this country at the very least. But, the main point I'm making is that you never hear Tesco struggling to feed everyone in the country. You never hear of media groups saying they're struggling to entertain everyone in the country, although that's probably not as true now as it was. You never hear of clothing brands saying that they're struggling to clothe everyone in the country, and that's because these are all private sectors. They're dealing with the problem and the signals as they see. Whereas when it comes to absolutely everything in the public sector, where productivity hasn't improved for 3 decades, yeah, they're really struggling. And I'm not surprised about that. And the problem with housing is that while the majority of it is in the private sector, it's being completely and utterly choked by public sector laws, i.e. the laws of Britain, the Town and Country Planning Act of 1948, and much of the housing regulation that has come in over the past few decades, where you simply can't build anything other than a barrack estate, as I've said in the past. And I'm genuinely on the side of I don't think people would care about houses being built if there were 2 conditions. One, it was housing stock that was majority going and being sold to people of this country, and 2, if it looked like Bath, essentially, if you actually made these estates look beautiful and actually be helpful for family life in such that there is a good mix of residential and commercial use, it's close to jobs, and it is close to park amenities and leisure centres and things like that. I think if there was more of that, people wouldn't have much of a problem. But the problem is that barrack estates are entirely residential, they look ugly, and people can obviously see the immigration numbers coming in, even though they think that the problem is with illegal immigration. It's not, it's with legal immigration, as it's close to 1 million people coming in a year. And they're naturally going to assume, well, if they're coming in, they're obviously going to want to buy a house, and therefore they're probably going to buy these new builds. And again, I can see the logic there. So government's got to deal with those 2 issues, but they're dealing with those issues in the complete opposite way as they should, and instead making it easier for absolutely anyone to buy a house, which is increasing demand and making it harder to save for a deposit, etc, etc, etc.
I feel for everyone who's concerned. Everyone should have a right to have a home,
Again, a very boomer take on the word right. A lot of the time when people, boomers, millennials, whoever, say, oh, everyone has the right to X, Y, and Z, what they really mean is, wouldn't it be nice if everyone had X, Y, or Z? From my perspective, it's that everyone has the right to go about their own business without it being impeded by anyone including the state. As long, obviously, as it is not infringing on anyone else's right to do that. Yes, I know that's quite a cringe libertarian way to look at the world, but the fact of the matter is that if everyone did that, you'd probably find yourself with a pretty conservative culture. Because most people, by definition, are conservative because they like what they know. But anyway, that's by the by. This whole idea that everyone has a right to housing has just ended up with everyone thinking that they have a right to own their own home, and therefore everything needs to be done to make sure that they own their own home, which is quite ironic because obviously a lot of this idea is pushed from leftist sources, and these leftist sources don't even believe in private property, but again, by the by. The realistic thing to do is just to try and let the market do what it can, while at the same time protecting genuine places of beauty. I have no problem with protecting fields in the Cotswolds and not having Barrett Estates or any other type of new town or things like that built there, but in places that aren't particularly beautiful, say spots just off motorway interchanges, I have no idea why people would go out of their minds to try and defend that sort of thing. And at the end of the day, as I say, there are two reasons for that. One, people want to keep the value of their house, and that's not going to happen if the house prices go down. And two, if we're honest, a lot of people don't like the idea of building houses just for foreigners to move into them. And again, I can completely understand that mindset. So again, this isn't a particularly difficult situation to actually work around. It's just the government is doing the absolute opposite of what they should be doing. They're making it basically impossible to build houses. They're having demand-side subsidies constantly added to the treasury books, and they're doing absolutely nothing about immigration. So it's a recipe for disaster. No wonder no one can afford a house, according to millennials, despite the fact that all of my friends own houses.
Whether that's rented, provided, or whether that's you fund it yourself through a mortgage. So
right, so this guy's just said everyone has the right to own a house, and then he's turned around and said, oh, but only if you can afford it, which is quite a funny way to look at rights. You can have your rights as I deem them as long as you can afford it.
That's a basic principle. Everyone should have a home. However, obviously there's just not enough housing around, there's not enough money around, and people struggle, which is it's very sad to see.
The issue isn't with the amount of money that's around. By the amount of money that everyone has, we should be about £2,000 everyone richer in terms of their living standards than 1999. It's gone up, and it's not gone up by that much, I will agree, but really the standard of living should be similar to 1999, but it's not. And the main reason for that, as far as I can see, is because yeah, it's entirely down to the bottleneck of housing. Hence, I want more built, and I want a lot of foreigners that shouldn't be here. Not just because they're foreign, by the way, but for a multitude of reasons, such as they can't speak English, or they're not making enough money to actually be a net positive in the UK, which, as far as lefties argue anyway, that's what they should be doing. Then you'd probably see a vast improvement to the supply and demand graphs, and therefore the prices of houses. But again, instead we're doing the opposite. Hence we have a bottleneck in living standards because, yeah, for some people half their income does go straight on rent, when in the past it would be closer to a quarter or a third. I mean, that's quite a lot of your income.
And of course, one thing we haven't spoken about is rents and rentable value. This, as far as I can see, is such a difficult area, isn't it, for young people that have to find this huge amount of dead money.
Again, very late 20th century thinking. It was not odd for most people to be renting in the old days and still be able to save money. And it's kind of annoying because I reckon if food and all that costed more than it does today and was taking up a lot more of your proportion of your income, I don't think people would be calling it dead money. And I know the difference there is that you can potentially own your own home. You can't, well, you will own your own food, obviously, but you need to consume it quite quickly for it not to go off. But having said that, I don't think it's dead money to be paying for somewhere to live. And yes, I do think it's more useful to put it into an asset that you can sell later on. Yes, again, I do understand that, but it's this whole outlook of you failed if you're renting. Like, no, I don't agree with that. I probably would be renting if I were to live in a city, because I know I'm not going to live there forever. The reason I've bought this house is because I know I'm going to be here on a relatively permanent basis. We're talking a decade or something like that, whereas when it comes to living in a city, I know that I would never be living there for more than 3 years at the most. And I think that's pretty similar with most other people. Most people in the media, they tend to actually job hop, and especially this guy who's clearly doing vox pops. I don't see a reason why you can't do that on a semi-permanent basis and be a correspondent for somewhere in the UK and travel beyond that, or even for the entirety of the UK. Again, it's an online magazine. I don't know why you can't work from home and live anywhere. and have to go to the office once in a while. I know plenty of people with jobs who work from home and go into the office once in a while, and so therefore they can live anywhere in the UK. And that's the deal. They come in and they understand that they're not going to be there for the full day because of public transport or even driving a car. It's unreasonable to expect that. So again, this all comes down to life choices, and we can't just say to people, you've made life choices that have ended up with you in this way.
To just keep living and find, to have a roof over their head.
Not to mention the state of some rented properties as well. You hear some real horror stories.
Indeed, yes.
Again, yes, you hear some horror stories, and yes, if the landlords have genuinely done anything wrong, I am perfectly fine with them being prosecuted for it. However, these are rare occurrences, and again, as the example we looked at before, from Fatima, she was given plenty of alternatives and didn't take them. So again, in some of these horror stories, this might be an unpopular opinion, but I reckon it's actually their own fault sometimes. Again, I've had black mould in rented properties. It seems pretty normal for any house in the United Kingdom. I don't know why it's only on the landlord to make sure no black mould happens ever.
I think it's so easy to say to the young people, well, you've just got to work harder. Well, the government really has to create a firm grounding to allow them to do that. So they've got to have the jobs, they've got to have the ability to go promotion throughout their companies, generate more cash so they can actually save and amount to that.
Again, I've said it before and I'll say it again. Generally with the private sector business, they're doing pretty well at increasing productivity and improving wages. When it comes to public sector, they're on strike all the time because they don't feel their wages are as high as they should be, i.e. they're not as high as the private sector. Well, the reality of the situation is your productivity isn't improving in the public sector, so why would your pay increase? Oh, inflation. Right, well, really that isn't good enough. That's good enough for a bit of a pay rise, not necessarily for one that is equal to a private sector that is much, much more productive than your sector. But again, these homeowners are asking for the complete wrong thing yet again. Oh, we need the government to help them have the groundwork to provide these jobs. 1 million vacancies, increase wages. Generally they have been, especially in the private sector. It's never, oh, they need to build way more houses, or, oh, they need to cut immigration, especially when it comes to left-wing homeowners or embarrassed right-wing homeowners. And as I say, I think part of the reason for that is that they want to keep their house prices high, which is completely in their interest and they are incentivised to do so, don't get me wrong. But as I've been saying even since I have bought my house, I would rather just see more houses being built and less foreigners in for different reasons, but less pressure on the demand side, let's say, so that houses do become more affordable for pretty much everyone. And it will also mean all house prices come down, and therefore I can buy more expensive ones for a cheaper price.
And then, of course, we want them to, they need to have to build the bedrock of a house, sustainable bedrock, so they can have children, which the country is built on. Without the younger generation having children and the children having children, there's no country to speak of in the future. So there's...
Again, looking back throughout the history of Britain, more people were renting than in the 21st century and having more children. And cost of childcare is a different issue to this, but that is also a sector that is just absolutely skyrocketing in costs. And so once again, we need to do something about the demand side subsidies and the supply side needing reform to help out with all that. Because again, childcare is another quite restricted industry, and restricting supply makes prices go up. Who would have thunk?
This country tends to work in 4-year cycles, and a lot of these problems, and the one we're talking about today, is not a 4-year problem, it's a 20-year or a 30-year problem.
And he's talking about the future, by the way. This problem's actually been brewing for about 30 years. We've probably known that this was going to be an issue for years that has just been completely ignored. There's been economists who predict all these crashes and problems throughout history, and they're constantly ignored. I mean, the hyperinflation we recently saw in Western countries was completely predictable by economists at The Spectator, Kate Andrews, and she was just completely laughed at as, oh, just some mental journalist. And then, oh, what happens? We do hit hyperinflation. So if these people are predicting these problems, clearly they have a good head on their shoulders for what could actually be done about this sort of thing. And so, what do they say? I mean, don't get me wrong, I know that they are pretty much globalist neoliberals in the sense that they have not much issue with mass migration generally. But hey, I don't think their solution of build more houses, stop subsidising demand side is particularly a bad call. And to be honest, we can have a bit more restriction on immigration anyway within their worldview, because quite frankly, they are completely reasonable and for only having large amounts of migration from countries that aren't causing problems with their peoples in the UK, such as pretty much most places in Western Europe and obviously the Anglosphere. I mean, to be honest, I don't think open borders between all these places would necessarily be a bad thing, as long as obviously the open borders are restricted only to people with passports from those countries, i.e. if, say, Canada is allowing mass migration from other countries, let's say, then obviously that'll be on a visa only for Canada. They can't then get on a plane straight to Britain. You'd still need border control is what I'm saying. Anyway, as I say, by the by, point being, build more houses. Yes, let's keep the beautiful places beautiful. There's plenty of them in the UK, but there's still space to build. And I'm not going the way of Tom Harwood and saying, look at all this farmland, it needs to be completely decimated with concrete. You can build beautiful green cities that still house a lot of people. Any building should not be shut down. We live in a NIMBYocracy. Like it or not, that needs to change. Otherwise, you're going to end up making a lot more communists. That's all I'll say.
This is how, and it's got to be cross-party. These issues have got to be looked at in the long term, not 4 years, but 10, 20 years. Planning, building houses, 20, 30 years.
And if you're expecting a cross-party to be in favour of building houses at all, you're quite mistaken. Both seem to want to keep this whole housing bubble in place so that the NHS and other social services can be funded by the fact that our economy is mostly just a housing bubble. So yeah, good luck with that. I can't see this changing while we still have the incentives of universal suffrage and 4-year terms, 5-year terms even. So yeah, good luck with hoping for that, but I don't think it's going to change until we have a huge reform of the way that our government works. But hey, that could come sooner than we think. Anyway, that's everything I had for you today. So, once again, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.